Hey everyone, this is Jared. Warhammer Vermintide 2 is the latest incarnation of the Left 4 Dead style of multiplayer co-op. Developed by Fat Shark, the focus is on gritty melee combat, which means you'll be up close and personal when it comes time to dismember the hordes of Skaven and Rotblood raiders. The game has been an open pre-order beta for the past week, and I've run a ton of benchmarks to see how it performs. There's just one small problem. Getting repeatable and useful benchmarks is tricky. If you want to see how the game runs in worst-case scenarios, that typically happens when you're fighting off dozens of enemies. But using such a scene as a benchmark is impractical since the number and location of the enemies is basically randomized. That's all thanks to an AI director that chooses when and what enemies to throw at you. Not to mention, you often need to progress several minutes into a level before being attacked by a horde, and the need to restart the game every time you change certain settings, like texture quality. Since I want repeatable results, I've compromised somewhat by using the first part of the Empire in Flames level, which is more demanding than some of the other levels I've had a chance to play so far. The caveat is that frame rates can drop substantially in some cases compared to the average frame rates I'm showing, so keep that in mind. Basically, the minimum 97th percentile average frame rate is representative of what you might average in some more demanding scenes. The full article on PCGamer.com covers the settings in more detail, and I have benchmarks for all the primary presets, from lowest quality up through extreme quality. The combination of co-op and melee combat that favors broadly swinging your sword to hit multiple enemies in Vermintide 2 means maintaining an extreme high frame rate isn't as critical as in competitive shooters where aiming is more nuanced. But that's only if you're playing a melee-minded character. The Elf Carillion, for example, is first and foremost an archer. Either way, 60 FPS and above should be sufficient, while dropping below 30 FPS can bog things down and make it more difficult to react to what's happening on screen. For these tests, I'm using the NVIDIA 391.01 and AMD 18.3.1 drivers. Both sets of drivers are game ready for Vermintide 2, though in limited testing it doesn't appear that performance on most parts has changed much since previous drivers. I checked DirectX 11 and DirectX 12 also on a limited selection of cards and found that in all of my testing, DX11 improved performance. That may change in the future as the developers spend more time optimizing the DX12 code, but the results shown here use DX11. Let's start with 720p lowest quality running on integrated graphics. AMD's Ryzen 5 2400G with Vega 11 graphics does pretty well overall, while Intel's HD 630 has frame rates ranging from 30 to 60 FPS. Keep in mind, this is with a less demanding scene, so performance can get quite a bit worse than this during an intense battle. While the integrated graphics solutions are shown in both 1080p and 720p, all of the dedicated graphics cards are running at 1080p lowest quality. They easily manage 60 FPS and even more. Kick things up a notch to 1080p low quality and you'll need a modest graphics card to stay above 60 FPS. But the good news is that everything from the GTX 1050 and RX 560 and above should suffice. For previous generation hardware, the GTX 760 is typically a bit slower than the 1050 and is generally similar in performance to AMD's HD 7870. Either one should be more than enough for 30 FPS, though 60 FPS could get a bit spotty at higher quality settings. Something else to note is that CPU performance can also become a factor, particularly when large groups of enemies swarm the party. Even with the overclocked i7 8700K, it's still limiting frame rates on the fastest GPUs, and slower CPUs can drop frame rates well below the 100 FPS mark at times, regardless of your graphics card. 1080p medium makes the game even more demanding, dropping performance by around 35% on most of the GPUs. NVIDIA's cards tend to hold a slight lead over their AMD counterparts, so the GTX 1063GB is a bit ahead of the RX 574GB. The 1050 Ti, meanwhile, is significantly faster than the RX 560. Sticking with 1080p but moving to the high preset, performance drops another 35% or so compared to medium quality. Looking at the mainstream cards, NVIDIA continues to hold a small lead over AMD at most price tiers. It will be interesting to see if future updates to the DX12 code can improve AMD's performance, which is something I've seen in other DX12 titles. Going beyond the high preset really doesn't improve the overall experience much, though performance drops another 15 to 20%. If you want to max out image quality at 1080p while still maintaining 60 FPS, even with swarms of enemies attacking, you're looking at GTX 1070 or RX Vega 56 and above. Otherwise, the already established patterns in performance continue to hold. 1440p using the extreme quality preset is going to require a substantial GPU for 60 FPS. While the Vega 56 and 1070 both manage this in my test sequence, they can easily drop below that mark in the midst of a battle. Realistically, you'll either want to drop settings a notch or two for 1440p gaming, or else you'll need at least a 1080 if not a 1080 Ti. You'll also still want a decent CPU. more on that in a moment. The gap between the NVIDIA and AMD GPUs also starts to increase at higher resolutions, with even the 1063GB now beating the RX 588GB. As usual, 4K extreme quality proves to be too much for most graphics cards, and even the GTX 1080 Ti will have difficulties in many areas of the game. Dropping to high quality improves performance by around 20 to 25%, and that might be sufficient, though a combination of medium and high settings is a better bet. AMD GPUs again fall short of their NVIDIA counterparts, though interestingly, the old R9 390 still does quite well. Memory bandwidth definitely helps at higher resolutions. For the CPU testing, besides my usual GTX 1080 Ti, I've also included a couple of results for the RX 580 as a representative of mainstream GPU performance. At lower quality settings, CPU bottlenecks are still a problem, and Intel's processors continue to easily surpass AMD's Ryzen parts. Even the RX 580 with an Intel 8700K ends up beating any Ryzen processor paired with a 1080 Ti. As the quality settings increase, however, the bottleneck starts to shift toward the GPU, though again, large battles tend to tax the CPU more thanks to the additional AI calculations. At 1080p Extreme, there's still a difference between the faster and slower processors. The 4-core, 4-thread i3-8100 does start to struggle at extreme quality, however, falling behind the 6-core and 8-core Ryzen parts. Vermintide 2 is a game that will benefit from both CPU clock speed as well as additional cores and threads. On the notebook side of things, the CPU demands again show up, with the desktop 1066GB beating all the notebooks at lower quality settings. It's not until maximum quality that the GPUs start to fall more or less where I'd expect. The GS63VR is hit particularly hard since it has a thinner chassis and reduced cooling potential, resulting in lower CPU clocks. It drops well below 60 FPS whenever there's a lot happening in the game. Once again, thanks to MSI, who has teamed up with PC Gamer and provided the hardware and sponsorship for these performance analysis articles. The primary testbed uses MSI's Z370 Gaming Pro Carbon AC motherboard, with the AMD Ryzen CPUs running on the MSI X370 Gaming Pro Carbon. Both systems use 16GB of DDR4 3200 CL14 memory. The graphics cards are MSI's factory overclocked Gaming X series, except for the RX 560 Aero and the reference RX Vega cards, and I've moderately overclocked these as well to mimic the Gaming X line. Warhammer Vermintide 2 can certainly run on lower spec PCs, and the good news is that 30 FPS is still quite playable. However, unlike many other games where the main hardware choice comes down to your graphics card, you'll want a fairly potent CPU to avoid stutters and framerate drops during intense battles. Since the game has just launched, there's also potential for improvements in performance over time, both via patches as well as through driver updates. That's something to keep an eye on during the coming weeks.